respect it as a parent. I understand why he would do it.
Yeah.
But I wonder to understand why lie about it for so long.
I'd stop calling it a lie.
Okay, why repeatedly say you're not going to and you do? And secondarily, for the part of this country, half of it that doesn't support Biden, doesn't know him personally, doesn't get to have phone calls, and they're just looking at a system that seems like it only benefits the people who are in power.
I'm going to say,
what precedent does that?
It started like any other weekday morning on The View. Bright lights, smiling hosts, coffee mugs in hand, the kind of polished, camera-ready calm that viewers have come to expect. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then it happened. The conversation turned to the 2024 election, a topic that had already been skated around for weeks. The panel eased into it, touching on campaign strategy, Republican threats, and voter outreach. But when someone mentioned the question that had been hanging silently over every Democratic talking point, is Joe Biden still capable of leading? The atmosphere in the studio shifted like a thunderclap. The smiles faded, the eye contact stopped. The tone turned icy, the kind of cold tension that the cameras can't hide, no matter how bright the studio lights are. It was the kind of moment you don't plan for, but once it starts, you know there's no pulling it back. What came next wasn't some dramatic disagreement over policy. It wasn't a polite, Sunday morning roundtable analysis. It was something raw, something real, and it came from Alyssa Farah Griffin. She leaned forward, calm but deliberate, and said what no one else on the panel had dared to speak out loud. This isn't about politics anymore. It's about a cover-up. The other women blinked. The audience barely reacted, stunned into silence. Alyssa didn't flinch. She said what many Americans had been whispering at kitchen tables and texting in private group chats for over a year, that Joe Biden was no longer fit to lead, and worse, that his party knew it and covered it up anyway. It was the kind of moment that breaks the illusion. Because for months, viewers had been spoon-fed glossy montages, carefully cut interviews, and public appearances meant to assure the public that everything was fine. But as Alyssa spoke, it became clear. Someone on the inside had stopped playing along. She wasn't making it personal. She wasn't throwing insults. She was doing something far more dangerous on a national talk show. Telling the truth. This wasn't just a political disagreement. It was an unmasking. And before the producers could cut to commercial, before anyone could paper over the cracks, another voice joined her. It wasn't the loudest or flashiest voice at the table, but it added weight, because once Sarah N. spoke, everything changed. Alyssa didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes or throw out catchphrases. Instead, she spoke with the kind of quiet conviction that's hard to ignore, the kind that doesn't need to shout, because the truth carries its own volume. Sitting across from her co-hosts, she dropped the line that turned a morning segment into national headlines. This isn't politics. This is a cover-up. The studio didn't explode. It froze. It wasn't just what she said, it was who she was saying it to, and where. The View has long been a safe space for Democratic talking points, a place where criticism of the party is softened, if not outright deflected. But Alyssa, a former White House communications official, knew the game from the inside. And on that morning, she stopped playing it. She laid it out plainly. For 4 years, the American people had been fed a version of Joe Biden that was, in her words, carefully constructed. His public image had been propped up by selective interviews, tightly scripted appearances, and loyal media outlets willing to crop out the awkward pauses and sudden silences. But behind the scenes, she claimed, the people closest to him knew the truth, and they kept it quiet. According to Alyssa, this wasn't a one-off mistake or a few bad news cycles. This was a deliberate strategy. Hide the decline, deny the concerns, and dismiss anyone who asked questions, even voters. Especially voters. She referenced the now famous 2023 poll showing 77% of Americans believed Biden was too old to serve another term. Instead of taking it seriously, Democratic leadership waved it away. They didn't just ignore their base. They instructed them to stay focused. Don't panic, and most of all, don't say it out loud. That was the real betrayal. That a man aged before the country's eyes. But that the people entrusted with power refused to admit it was happening, and that silence wasn't just in Washington. It echoed across media, talk shows, even this very stage. Until that moment, no one on The View had dared to pierce it. Alyssa did. And in doing so, she cracked something wide open. She didn't just accuse party leaders of hiding the truth. She accused them of gaslighting the very people who had voted them into power. And she wasn't wrong to call it what it was. A cover-up wrapped in good intentions, sold as loyalty, but rooted in fear. Fear of admitting they had backed the wrong man for the hardest job in the world. That kind of honesty, especially from someone inside the tent, left the table rattled, but it also left an opening. Because the moment she finished, Sarah N., normally the voice of reason and restraint, did something unexpected. She leaned in and backed her up. And when she did, the conversation turned from quiet confession to full-blown confrontation. That it's one thing to speak an uncomfortable truth alone. It's something else entirely when someone next to you says, "You're right," especially when that person rarely takes sides. Sarah N. isn't known for grandstanding or picking political fights. On The View, she usually plays the role of the thoughtful middle voice, someone who listens carefully and balances the extremes. But that morning, as Alyssa finished laying out her case against the silence surrounding Joe Biden's condition, Sarah didn't hesitate. She looked across the table, her voice steady but firm, and said, "The biggest mistake Democrats made was pretending we didn't see what everyone else could." It was a sentence that changed the room. Sarah wasn't throwing punches. She was stating what millions of everyday Americans had felt for months. People who watched President Biden stumble during speeches, lose his place at press events, or freeze during interviews, not with malice, but with growing concern, and instead of hearing their worries echoed by party leaders, those voters were told to hush, to stay focused, to trust the process. Sarah called it out for what it was. "We weren't crazy," she said. "We were paying attention." She explained how frustrating it had become to watch her own party dismiss legitimate concern as right-wing fear-mongering. The Democrats hadn't just avoided the conversation, they had tried to control it, spinning every obvious lapse into a gotcha moment from Fox News or chalking it up to right-wing ageism. But it wasn't about AGIT, it was about capacity. And for a lot of Americans, that disconnect was the breaking point. Sarah reminded the panel that trust isn't built by telling voters what to think. It's built by listening to what they already feel and meeting them there with honesty. That morning, the table turned, because when someone as grounded as Sarah backs a claim like Alyssa's, it's no longer just one person venting frustration. It becomes a movement, one that suddenly had a voice in mainstream media. Their message wasn't that Joe Biden was a bad man. It was that the people protecting his image had stopped being honest with the country. And when leaders stop being honest, people stop following. Across the table, Sunny and Joy shifted uncomfortably. They weren't ready to go there, not yet. But behind the scenes, producers were already scrambling. And at that very moment, millions of viewers leaned forward in their chairs, knowing something real was happening. Because what Sarah and Alyssa had just done wasn't just bold, it was brave. But what came next went even further. They didn't just question whether Biden was fit to lead. They asked the question no one had dared say out loud on national TV: who's really running the country? As Sarah's voice faded and the room fell still, a new question filled the silence, one heavier than any that had come before. It wasn't, just is Joe Biden slipping anymore? It was, if he's not fully in control, who is? Alyssa leaned forward, almost like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. Calm but clear, she spoke the words others had only whispered behind closed doors. This isn't just about one man. It's about the machine propping him up. She named names: Pelosi, Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, even Barack Obama. Not to villainize, but to highlight a pattern. Powerful figures behind the scenes making critical decisions. While the person in front of the camera smiled, waved, and sometimes stumbled through the script, Alyssa painted a picture that was hard to unsee. Press releases prepared without his input, summits scheduled without his full awareness, speeches that seemed rehearsed till he lost his place. Then she dropped a line that cut through the studio like a blade. Joe Biden is not running the country. He's being used to run it. It wasn't said in anger, but in deep frustration. Because to many, this wasn't just a political issue, it was a betrayal. Americans believed they were voting for a leader. Instead, they may have gotten a figurehead. With unelected insiders pulling the levers in the background, Sarah backed her up again, pointing to what felt off for so many viewers. How could a man who once opposed gay marriage and school integration suddenly become the banner carrier for progressive revolution? How did pride flags fly over the White House not as a deliberate decision from the president, but as part of a performance carefully staged by the party? The audience didn't need to be told. They remembered the footage: Biden freezing mid-sentence, wandering off at press events, shaking hands with people who weren't there. These weren't just odd moments, they were warning signs. And yet, time after time, the party insisted all was fine. It wasn't about attacking Joe Biden as a person, it was about the principle. If the president can't lead, and no one tells the public the truth, what does that say about our democracy? The lesson hit hard. Leadership isn't just about titles, it's about responsibility. And if decisions are being made behind a curtain, voters have a right to know who's pulling it. But this wasn't the end of the reckoning, because when the conversation shifted from who's running the show to why the show went on for so long, a whole new storm erupted. And the next person to step into the fire wasn't Alyssa or Sarah, it was Sunny. But not in the way anyone expected. If the conversation had already been uncomfortable, what came next made it undeniable. Alyssa leaned in again, this time softer, almost regretful. She wasn't yelling, she didn't need to. All she did was bring up one name: George Clooney. The room paused. Everyone knew Clooney. He wasn't just a celebrity, he was a cultural fixture. Beloved, respected, recognized everywhere from small-town diners to global red carpets. And more importantly, he had always been politically active, a loyal Democrat, who rarely criticized his party in public. But something had happened recently that shook even him. Alyssa recounted it with calm precision. George Clooney had flown in from Italy to headline a high-profile fundraiser for Joe Biden. He made time, he moved schedules, he did what loyal supporters do. show up when the party calls. And President Biden, he didn't recognize him, not in passing, not in a moment of distraction. At a formal fundraiser where Clooney was one of the most high-profile names in the room, he walked up, extended a hand, and was met with a blank stare. Alyssa didn't tell the story with cruelty. In fact, there was a hint of sadness in her voice. "This isn't about George Clooney," she said. "It's about what it means when the leader of the free world can't identify one of the most famous people on the planet during a key political event." It was a moment that struck deep, because if a president can't recognize Clooney in a ballroom with the cameras rolling, what happens behind closed doors? What happens in the Situation Room at 3 a.m.? What happens when the call comes from the Pentagon, or the Kremlin, or Tehran? This wasn't a gotcha. It wasn't a meme. It was a glimpse into something far more serious: cognitive decline playing out in real time. And for many Americans watching at home, that moment at the fundraiser said more than any headline could. The lesson was sobering. When politics becomes about defending the brand rather than protecting the people, truth gets pushed aside. The Clooney moment wasn't about forgetting a name. It was about the system's refusal to admit something wasn't right, and how far they were willing to go to cover it up. And that cover-up, it didn't stop with voters. Because when another co-host finally tried to steer the conversation back toward policy and away from accountability, everything took a sharp, unexpected turn. And that co-host was Sunny. By now, the studio's atmosphere had shifted. You could feel it through the screen. The air was thick. The silence between words stretched just a second too long. Alyssa and Sarah had cracked open a door most never dared touch on live TV, and for a moment, the truth was standing there in plain sight. Uncomfortable, raw, real. But it didn't last. Joy Behar was the first to break the tension, and not with answers with what she always leaned on: Trump. It was almost automatic. As soon as Alyssa mentioned Biden's blank moment with Clooney, Joy interrupted with a sharp pivot. "Well, what about Trump? January 6th, the lies, the chaos." Her tone was familiar, righteous, a mix of disbelief and moral certainty. And here's the thing: no one on the panel was defending Trump. No one said he was innocent. But what Joy was doing was something else entirely. She was changing the subject. Rather than face the core issue whether Biden was still mentally and physically equipped to lead, Joy reached for the same card she'd played for years. Trump is worse. It was the political version of look over here, a distraction play, plain and simple. Then came Sunny Hostin. Her approach was different. Less fiery, more deflective. She didn't just pivot. She steamrolled the conversation with a list of every liberal talking point she could muster. Medicaid cuts, white supremacy, tax breaks for billionaires, foreign aid disparities, a sudden unprompted accusation that the administration was prioritizing white, South African refugees over Afghan and Ukrainian ones. None of it addressed what had just happened. Not Biden, not the leadership crisis, not the fundraiser moment that left everyone stunned. It was a wall of words meant to move the spotlight. And it worked, at least momentarily, but the audience noticed. You could see it in the way the camera hesitated on their faces. These weren't responses. These were shields. And that's the quiet lesson underneath. When institutions start deflecting instead of reflecting, trust erodes fast. People don't expect perfection, but they do expect honesty. What Joy and Sunny showed that day wasn't courage, it was fear. Fear of acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, the party they championed had made a catastrophic error in judgment. So they didn't correct the course. They doubled down. But that decision came at a price. Because the more they ducked the truth, the more it emboldened Alyssa. And in the next round of this battle, she didn't just talk policies or punditry. She went straight for the foundation of the democratic process itself. While the panelists on The View clashed over domestic politics, something much bigger was happening beyond those studio walls. It wasn't just Americans tuning in. The world was watching, too. And unlike some viewers at home, global leaders weren't distracted by partisan spin or talking points. They were studying every word, every stumble, every silence. And they drew their own conclusions. To countries like Russia, China, and Iran, it didn't matter how many polished press releases the White House issued. What they saw was a U.S. president who often paused mid-sentence, lost track of names, and seemed unsure. In moments of critical importance, to them, that wasn't just aging, it was opportunity. While the American media ran interference, insisting Biden was sharp as ever, Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Xi Jinping tightened his grip on Taiwan and made bold economic plays across the South China Sea. Iran escalated proxy attacks on Israel without hesitation. These weren't accidents. They were calculated moves based on a simple observation. America no longer looked like it had a strong hand on the wheel. Think about that for a second. In a world where military decisions are made in minutes and alliances can shift overnight, perception matters just as much as policy. And when that perception is weakness, it invites boldness from adversaries. Alyssa Griffin knew this, and she said it plainly. This isn't just about domestic confidence, she argued on air. It's about global consequences. Because if America's enemies sense uncertainty at the top, they don't pause to be polite. They act. And over the past few years, that's exactly what they've done. From cyberactics to energy manipulation to outright military aggression, the timeline is hard to ignore. What happened inside the View studio was just one version of a much larger story, one where denial and deflection at home led to danger abroad, and that's the takeaway most people don't want to admit. The world doesn't wait for us to figure things out, it reacts to the signals we send. And lately, those signals have been anything but steady. Heat of global pressure grew, so did the cracks inside the Democratic machine. And when voters at home started questioning not just Biden but the system that protected him, the conversation took a sharp turn into something even more controversial. Because what do you call it when there's no real debate, no real primary? That's where Alyssa went next. And this time, she wasn't just raising her voice. She was raising the alarm. By the time the studio lights began to dim, the conversation had shifted from a debate about Joe Biden's ability to something far more unsettling. Alyssa, Sarah, and even some quiet nods from behind the scenes had all pointed to one chilling idea: maybe Biden wasn't really calling the shots at all. What if the presidency itself had become more performance than power? That's when the phrase started floating between panelists and pundits alike. The machine behind the curtain? It wasn't some wild conspiracy theory, it was a growing belief that a network of advisors, strategists, and former Obama-era insiders were quietly steering the ship while the captain stood on deck, smiling and waving. The faces may have changed, but the hands on the wheel? Very familiar. People like Ron Klain, Susan Rice, Anita Dunn, names most Americans wouldn't recognize had the president's ear daily. And decisions on major issues, from immigration to foreign policy, often carried the fingerprints of the very people who shaped Washington a decade ago. Alyssa painted a picture that resonated deeply. She compared it to watching a theater play. You see the actor, you hear the lines, but backstage is where the real story's happening. Every carefully timed speech, every strategic pause, every media appearance was choreographed with one goal: maintain the illusion of control. And the most revealing moment, when Jill Biden, during a recent interview, answered a direct question meant for the president. It wasn't malice, it was instinct. It felt normal, but that was the point. Americans had quietly become used to it, and that normalization, according to Alyssa, was the real danger. It raised a hard question. If the man elected to lead the free world needed a handler who was really leading, this wasn't about partisanship anymore. It wasn't about left or right, it was about trust. And what happens when that trust is replaced by managed perception? The lesson was simple. A democracy can survive disagreement. It can weather political storms and sharp divides, but what it cannot afford is silence where there should be accountability, and that silence was about to be broken even louder. Because the next part of the conversation wasn't about behind-the-scenes strategy anymore. It was about the voters, what they saw, what they were told to ignore, and the moment they finally said, enough. There are moments in television that don't just land, they linger. They hang in the air long after the camera pans away, the audience stops clapping, and the credits roll. That's exactly what happened when Alyssa Griffin dropped her final stunning blow. The kind of line that slices through the noise and leaves a room speechless. The studio had already weathered waves of sharp exchanges and political revelations. But this was different. With a steady voice and unblinking eyes, Alyssa leaned into the microphone and told a story that hadn't yet gone public. It wasn't a policy debate or another philosophical divide. It was something personal, something simple, and something deeply unsettling. She spoke about a high-profile fundraiser in Los Angeles, one of those glittering events where Hollywood and Washington collide: celebrities, donors, politicians, and in the center of it all was President Joe Biden. Also in attendance that night, George Clooney. Alyssa told the panel and the millions watching that during this event, Joe Biden did not recognize Clooney. At first, the audience chuckled nervously. Surely it was a mix-up, but she didn't flinch. This wasn't a punchline, it was a red flag. Because George Clooney isn't just another face in a crowd. He's one of the most recognizable figures on the planet, and if the President of the United States couldn't place him at a calm, rehearsed, and carefully controlled environment, what did that say about his mental readiness in a true crisis? The room went quiet, dead quiet, no one interrupted, no one deflected. Even the hosts who had spent the morning defending Biden sat still, eyes wide, jaws slightly dropped. It wasn't just the content of what Alyssa said, it was the clarity. No spin, no drama. Just a chilling fact that landed like a thunderclap. And then she twisted the knife. If he can't recognize George Clooney in a ballroom, how can he recognize a military threat at 3 a.m.? That wasn't theater. That was real fear. She wasn't mocking, she wasn't gloating. She was simply pointing out what many had noticed, but few dared to say. That this wasn't about ageism or partisan rivalry. This was about capacity, competence, and whether the most important job in the world was still being done by the man elected to do it. That moment marked a turning point. The energy in the studio shifted from defensive to reflective. There were no comebacks, no jokes, just silence. A silence louder than any debate. And that silence carried weight. Because everyone in that room and watching at home understood what came next wasn't just political fallout. It was personal. The next part of the story wasn't about panelists or presidents. It was about the voters, the people who were finally ready to speak. In the days after that episode aired, the buzz didn't die. Down it grew louder. Clips from the show went viral. Hashtags trended. Viewers from every political corner, even those who once dismissed daytime talk, tuned in and asked the same question. How long has this been going on? Because what that moment exposed wasn't just a president out of step, it was a party caught in a loop of denial. For years, the Democratic establishment had built itself on the idea of being the grown-ups in the room, the party of facts, of science, of reason. But when reality came knocking, when voters raised serious concerns about Joe Biden's capacity to lead, it wasn't met with transparency or humility. It was met with dismissal. Instead of adjusting course or opening up a national conversation, the party doubled down. The concerns were labeled as right-wing talking points. Those who spoke out were cast as disloyal, even dangerous. And the phrase, "Trump is worse," became a shield used to block every form of introspection. But here's the thing about denial. It doesn't hold forever, especially not in a country already teetering. Inflation had tightened its grip on working families, parents, worried about school safety and curriculum changes. Cities struggled with crime and drug crises. At the southern border, the system buckled under the weight of policy confusion and political games. People weren't watching cable news for fun anymore. They were watching for survival. And every time those very real fears were brushed aside as manufactured outrage, the distance between the people and their leaders grew wider. Take Michelle from Pennsylvania, a lifelong Democrat, single mom of two. She'd voted blue in every election since she turned 18, but now, she found herself questioning what she was even supporting. It's not about Trump, she told a reporter. It's about them not listening to us anymore. Or Jamal in Michigan, a union worker who watched jobs dry up while his party leaders held diversity summits instead of town halls. They're talking to each other, he said, not to us. And that's where the pressure built. Quietly, relentlessly, like a fault line waiting to rupture. What Alyssa and Sarah did on live television wasn't just brave, it was necessary. They cracked open a truth so many had been afraid to say out loud. You cannot lead a nation by pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't. The lesson was clear. Trust isn't lost overnight. It erodes slowly every time a leader dodges instead of answers, spins instead of admits. But when it breaks completely, it doesn't just come with voter apathy. It comes with something far more dangerous: disengagement. And that's where the country was heading. Until now. Because after that silence in the studio, something shifted. Not just in the tone of the show but in the country itself. People were finally starting to speak again. And what came next wasn't going to be televised. It was going to be decided in living rooms, around kitchen tables, and at the ballot box. The reckoning had only just begun. What started as just another morning on The View became a national moment of reckoning. Alyssa Griffin dared to break the silence. Sarah N. stood with her. Together, they exposed what many Americans had been sensing but no one in power wanted to say out loud. That the president might no longer be leading, and worse, that a party built on transparency was now hiding behind a curtain of control. From the viral Clooney moment to the studio's stunned silence. From Joy and Sunny's desperate deflections to the quiet nods of agreement from disillusioned voters, this wasn't just a conversation, it was a mirror. And what we saw staring back wasn't just a party in denial, but a country desperate for honesty. The message is simple. Leadership demands truth, and truth begins with the courage to say what everyone else is afraid to admit. Thank you for watching. If this story made you think, made you feel, or made you question, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who still believes truth matters. Until next time, take care and stay curious.